Welcome back, everyone. The 30 Years' War and why it was so devastating. Kings and generals. 30 Years' War is a interesting period of time when Catholicism and people who started to stray away from control of the papacy and maybe even the emperorship of the HRE. We immediately saw this with the King of England, Henry VIII, but then it's just going to continuously culminate across Europe. Nations like Sweden, France, Germany, and so forth, having issues with this at large. So here we go.
War brings death and destruction to everyone who's involved in it, from soldiers in the armies to sailors and merchants. Nevertheless, it is the civilian population that suffers the most.
And that is something I've always said, and something that always will be true. There's the obvious factoids of like civilians dying because of atrocities or casualties or of just I forget the word, but basically the word is collateral damage. You hear that a lot. But besides just being collateral damaged, there's famine, there's disease, there's economic problems that just riddle a society. There's psychological damage. There's family struggles with death. There's layers of it too.
This is especially true for the 30 Years' War. Although the effect that the war had on religion, warfare and politics are thoroughly covered, its effects on the general populace are often overlooked.
I'm glad we're doing this video because this is like right at my alley when it comes to like I really love to understand the deep impacts of conflict like this.
This is even more surprising considering the fact that millions of people died and that the Holy Roman Empire lost between a quarter and a third of its population, with some areas having lost more than half. A variety of factors contributed to the devastation, and we will discuss them in this video. But before we jump to the video, a few words about the sponsor of this video, Raid Shadow Legends.
Alright, Raid Shadow Legends.
And if you're a new this as the 30 Years' War lasted for 3 decades between 1618 and 1648, the fighting varied in intensity and scope depending on the region and the year in question. During the initial phase of the war, the action was concentrated along the Danube, Upper Hungary, Bohemia and Moravia.
Yeah, I said Germany, but there is no such thing as Germany. There's German states within the HRE. A lot of stuff also happens within Austria, Bavaria, Bohemia, Brandenburg, which eventually becomes like Prussia. But then you also have conflict in the Netherlands, and so forth. It's riddled throughout Denmark.
Although all of the horrors of the war are largely associated with the final phase of the conflict, they were already present in the beginning. Plunder, plague, and the murder of civilians were widespread in the affected areas. Bohemia also saw an additional loss of population, as all non-Catholics who refused to convert were forced to leave. Following the Battle of White Mountain and the pacification of Bohemia, war operations continued in the territories of the Palatinate and in Lower Saxony. It is at this point that Frederick V decided to employ the services of Ernst von Mansfeld, a mercenary leader.
Of course, you can see where he's at, Sweden, and Sweden really starts to get their mercenary train shoe in, as they have. It's kind of like an indirect way of being neutral.
While serving under Frederick, Mansfeld's mercenaries plundered Alsace and Hesse. Not limiting themselves to the territories of their enemies, the mercenaries also ravaged the lands that they were supposed to protect. Mansfeld proved to be a shrewd leader, as after leaving Frederick's service, he subsequently entered the service of Christian of Brunswick and ravaged Lorraine, the United Provinces, and East Frisia while campaigning for his new employer. On paper, mercenaries seemed expensive to hire and maintain, and not many rulers would have the resources to hire them. However, they turned out to be one of the main causes of suffering and devastation during the war. The Protestants were on the cusp of defeat after the Battle of Stadtlohn. The possibility of a complete change in the religious balance in Central Europe worried King Christian IV of Denmark, and he would enter the war in 1625.
Yeah, if you look at a map of like Europe in this time, most of the north has started to go towards Protestantism, but most of the south is more Catholicism. That varies. There's pockets, but for the most part, that's kind of what it looks like. So you got Christian IV, Protestant, coming down.
Seeing this as a serious threat, the emperor asked Albrecht von Wallenstein for military assistance. The ever-ambitious Wallenstein, not satisfied with the gains that he had made during the Bohemian campaign, agreed to help only if he was allowed to plunder the territories that he would capture.
It's crazy, bro. Can we just like steal everything and then just create war crimes and atrocities? War crimes didn't even matter at this point, I don't think. I don't even know if there was ever before the Treaty of Westphalia. Even the Treaty of Westphalia, I don't know if it ideates any language when it comes to. I'll have to read it one day. But I don't think it ideates language that refers to war and what is the guidelines of such. Because I don't think there are much, guidelines to how you conduct war and so forth. So there isn't even a war crime like category.
Wallenstein's army ravaged Lower Saxony for much of late 1625 and 1626. The Danish were soundly defeated by both Thiel and Wallenstein. However, Wallenstein's insatiable ambition also led him to want a Baltic Sea port. To that end, he sought to capture Stralsund, and on the way to the city, his forces pillaged Mecklenburg and Pomerania. Besides the mercenaries, another important factor was the forces of the Catholic and Protestant leagues. These armies were indeed easier to finance than mercenaries, and in any ordinary war that would not have been a major problem. For the first few years of the 30 Years' War, it was not a problem either. But as time passed and the economies of the realms involved in the wars began to diminish, so did their ability to pay the soldiers.
Always a factor, which always drops morale, defections. Maybe not defections in this case at large. Usually you won't have defections in this, but you might. But people deserting is the better option.
By the end of the Danish involvement in 1630, the states involved in the war could only finance the recruitment and equipment of their new soldiers. Meanwhile, the soldiers' salaries and supplying the armies fell upon the civilians of the regions where the armies were. During the 1620s, armies frequently relied upon so-called contributions, when either the governors of the affected areas would pay a certain amount of money, or the army itself would extort funds from the civilians in an organized manner.
And that's kind of like, I think this is kind of like coinciding with like the plundering, right? You can't really pay your soldiers, and this is rampant throughout history. A way to pay your soldiers in some cases is the allowance to plunder. The disarray that this creates is just insane, really, because you create an economy of piracy versus rewarding with like a treasury, etc.
At times, the amount of money that the armies demanded was extraordinary, forcing the people to sell their stores of grain, wine, and other essentials in desperate attempts to satisfy mounting demands. The only two countries which were able to both pay and supply their soldiers for—
Let me guess. If we're not counting England, it's got to be France and Sweden, right?
For the entirety of the war were Spain and the United Provinces.
Okay, so like I didn't hit either option, but yeah, Spain. I'm stupid because obviously Spain, because Spain has so many gold reserves at this point from New America.
Therefore, it should be no wonder that the population of the Spanish and Dutch Netherlands escaped relatively unharmed from the war. The troops, of course, were suffering from a constant lack of supplies as well. As a result, they frequently took whatever the civilians had left in their stores. Production also declined as seed corn was consumed and vital assets like tools or mills were destroyed. The majority of the trade routes in the Holy Roman Empire were affected and trade ground to a halt. There were no alternative ways for people to acquire food. This left many areas of the empire with famine, and many people simply starved to death. The Swedish landing in Pomerania in 1630 initially did not change this pattern. Active operations resumed after a year's lull, but remained constant in Pomerania and Mecklenburg. Imperial and Catholic League units were withdrawn from other parts of Germany, either to confront the Swedes or to join the siege of Mantua. This much-needed respite for the people of the empire, along with the great harvests of 1630 and 1631, cushioned the rising troop numbers for a time.
So the Great Harvest, we think we don't really talk too much. That's interesting. Maybe I'm just missing it, but I don't really hear so much about the Great Harvest or the Great XYZ. I guess it was just because it was such a flow, if you're talking like ebbs and flows of hunger. This is a flow. Because we usually think like the Great Famine of 1631 or something. Interesting though. Just wanted to make that, but no.
The full effects were delayed until the Swedish exploitation of their victory at Breitenfeld rapidly spread the war into all parts of Germany by 1632. Total troop numbers reached an unprecedented 250,000, thanks to the new regional armies formed in Westphalia, Lower Saxony, the Upper Rhine and Swabia, as well as the main forces campaigning in Bavaria, Franconia and Electoral Saxony. The poor maintenance of the Imperial and Catholic League armies was quite evident by this point. Following the siege of Magdeburg in 1631, the ill-disciplined, hungry and unpaid army led by Thiel sacked the city. The city was...
Yeah, this was horrible. This is one of those horrendous versions of history right here. I mean, most sacks are the same. You just, as you can see illustrated here, by the way, amazing. We cannot give kings and generals enough credit for how they illustrate history for us. But obviously, you're just extorting their wealth. A lot of people hide. You know, they hide their wealth somehow because they know this is going to happen. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. But you see these people sleeping in the street. They're not sleeping. You can just imagine like the smells, the horror, the sounds that this particular day would bring. Oh, the psychological warfare too of this. It's just not good.
Almost completely burned down, and widespread looting, rape and murder occurred.
Horrible.
Of the 25,000 inhabitants of the city at the beginning of the siege, between 20,000 and 24,000 were dead.
Like 95% of your population's gone.
Unfed and unpaid soldiers proved difficult to control, even for a commander of Thiel's caliber, and he was only able to stop the sacking after 4 days. The ravaging of large walled cities was still an exception to the rule rather than the rule itself.
They become pirates.
Other than the sack of Magdeburg, large cities were quite rarely ravaged by armies, as they proved invaluable to each side. On the other hand, the people of smaller towns and the countryside bore the brunt of the war, with many of them ending up as refugees in those larger cities. Gustavus Adolphus famously remarked, "War will pay for war."
Depends what type of war you're doing, but yeah. If you're doing it like this, yeah, for sure. But if you're disciplined and you have some honor and a little bit more morals, and that's the crazy thing. Like all these people are fighting for Christendom. Christendom. They're fighting for their version of Christendom. Um, but isn't that ironic? Such a holy-esque war is just riddled with just atrocities.
Indicating that mobility was crucial for an army's survival, as staying for too long in one place would lead to starvation. The Scottish mercenary captain Robert Munro mentions in his memoirs that Gustavus Adolphus sympathized with the civilian population and wished to lessen the burden on them as much as he could. As starved soldiers were prone to take their frustrations out on the general populace, the Swedish king ensured that his army was paid a regular salary and that it would be supplied regularly. As bad as the situation was for the civilian population, after the death of Gustavus Adolphus, things only became worse.
Yeah, he has a series of good wins. He gets dubbed the father of modern warfare, and after that, you have a series of individuals that were like the leaders, like Wallenstein and Adolphus and a couple others, and eventually the emperor itself. But you have all these big players at the beginning of the war and then throughout the war that then just die. And the war doesn't even end. It just keeps going.
The commanders who took charge of the Swedish armies were far less concerned with the well-being of the commoners than their late king. Moreover, the soldiers were also rarely paid, as the commanders kept the money for themselves, and also suffered from food shortages. Much like in future wars, the Swedish army was forced to live off the land, leaving peasants with very little food, if any at all. Though sources offer diverging numbers, they all agree that the Swedes were responsible for the destruction of thousands of villages, towns, and other smaller settlements.
Yeah, like nobody is exempt from the dishonor here.
Years from 1632 to 1640 are considered to be the deadliest period of the war. This coincides with the death of the Swedish king, along with the beginning of French operations within the Holy Roman Empire. The three armies were exhausted from years of constant warfare. All semblance of order broke down, and the armies ravaged the countryside in the areas where they were stationed. In comparison to this brutal and indiscriminate raiding, the contributions of the 1620s seemed rather benign at this point. The historian Ronald G. Ashe mentions that, quite paradoxically, the civilians were also responsible for each other's suffering during the 1630s.
Why is that?
As armies raided, they took everything of value from each household, only to later sell it in the neighboring town for a tenth of its real price or exchange it for food. In addition, due to the constant marauding of the armies, many peasants resorted to banditry or formed militias, attacking civilians and soldiers alike.
I mean, I'm not surprised, because just like the soldiers, the citizens are people too, right? And they are also trying to feed their families. They're also probably in a desperate position, as the soldiers were. They're also, like I said, they're people too. They can take up arms. It's nothing to get a dagger. It might be nothing to get a. I mean, it's probably something to get like an actual gun at this point, but still, I can see there's definitely some ragtag militias that were formed.
The Imperial Army was especially under pressure, as it now faced two very formidable foes.
So the Imperial Army, obviously the direct army under the HRE.
Desperate, they began employing scorched earth tactics to make sure that the opposing armies would find absolutely nothing of use in involved areas.
Horrible.
The quick Swedish retreat from southern Germany left the Protestant provinces there vulnerable. As the Imperial armies took Württemberg, their treatment of the population and their desire to leave nothing for the Swedish army led to severe depopulation, with some estimates ranging to even 69% of the population. The Swedish and French armies themselves not in an envious position, followed suit and started using scorched earth tactics too. However,
So everyone's burning everything.
their involvement in the war
God.
brought respite to some areas. As the lands west of the Rhine were under French control much of the time, they had a chance to recover after 1636. The Habsburg monarchy also saw some peaceful years, and the majority of northern Germany also went through recovery before the Swedish invasion of Denmark in 1643. Until the end of the war, the only areas that were significantly affected were the areas with a large military presence. Southern Germany was severely devastated, as that is where the Bavarians and French frequently fought.
Yeah, I mean, that's where it intersects, really.
Bohemia and Moravia, after nearly 20 years of relative peace, once again became a battleground after the Swedes invaded. The population of Pomerania and Brandenburg, although not affected by war directly, was subjected to the cruelty of the Swedish garrisons which were posted there for prolonged periods of time.
Another little thing, you know, like there's people that stay behind garrisoned at a particular post, a city. Those people usually aren't like citizens of that place, so they're gonna do things softer. They're not gonna like loot crazily, but they will be a nuisance for sure. Sometimes they might not be as bad. Sometimes they'll be atrocious. Depends on, I guess, the temperature and who they are actually garrisoning and all of the other factors involved.
Although it is widely known that armies also decreased in size during this time, that proved to be a misconception, as the number of troops that each state fielded during the war gradually increased until 1648. Another effect which the war had on the Holy Roman Empire was of an ecological nature. There was an explosion in the rodent population during 1636 that lasted several years
Why was there explosion in the rodent population?
and exacerbated the food shortage. Wolves roamed southwestern Bavaria during 1638, returning in the early 1640s, while packs of wild pigs destroyed crops in 1639. Other animals disappeared as they became alternative sources of food. A Bavarian soldier marching along the Lower Rhine in February 1636 recorded that there was neither cat nor dog, while
Those are the first to go in a famine. Obviously.
there are numerous accounts of urban populations consuming both types of animals during the hunger years of the
It's crazy though.
1630s. Prolonged war, as always, also brought disease. Soldiers from various parts of Europe brought unfamiliar microbes with them to the empire. The civilian population, often starving, was susceptible to the various diseases that engulfed the lands.
Immune system's weaker.
For example, Wallenstein's campaign down the Elbe brought the plague to those areas, and northern Italy also suffered from a bubonic plague epidemic after the Mantuan War.
Jeez.
Scores of refugees crowding into large walled cities only exacerbated the spread of disease, both by contributing to the famine and by contagion. Furthermore, the aforementioned proliferation of rodent populations only made things worse for the cities which were overflowing with people. Although most sources only mention the plague, it is quite possible that dysentery and typhus caused many deaths too, as they became endemic to Germany in the final years of the war. By sheer numbers of casualties, the war was, quite possibly, the deadliest war in Europe until then. Total deaths in the empire may have surpassed 8 million, given the relatively high number of military casualties and the fact that the true extent of civilian losses is often masked by the presence of wartime births recorded in overall population tolls.
And for the military deaths, I mean, this is similar to World War I in the fact that, and it's often compared to such just because of like the innovations of that, and not technology, because I mean, gunpowder obviously was a thing, but like the utilization of gunpowder in different formations and just like the rapid fire and then the supply of gunpowder. Just, and when I say gunpowder, I'm talking guns. The supply of guns becomes a little bit more what's the way, mass produced, to where they're in a percentage of an army between like cavalry, infantry, and then like people who, so not, when I say infantry, whether there be pikemen or there be people who have a weapon, pikeman shot, the shot gets more and more percentage over the course of the and then of course cavalry actually have weapons as well. So you don't have machine guns by any means, but you definitely have like a new formational like utilization of gunpowder.
However, if we take into account the percentage of population loss, this war remains the most destructive war in European history.
It's crazy.
By comparison, the Soviet Union, which suffered the heaviest casualties of the Second World War, lost less than 12% of its
I didn't think it was that low. Wow. I thought it was way more than that. Soviet
population. Both 20th century world wars were of course briefer, with the casualties each year correspondingly higher. Nonetheless, around 20 million of those lost during the First World War were due to the influenza outbreak at its end. A significant portion of the victims of the Second World War were killed in deliberate genocide, a feature mercifully absent from the 30 Years' War that was also waged with much less potent weaponry. The population of the empire recovered slowly over the
I think they just didn't think about it, or they just didn't have the means to do it.
Following decades. However, the most profound effect that the war had was that it created a sense of unity within the German nation. With the people spending most of their lifetime at war, and 2 generations completely lost to warfare, there was still a silver lining in all of this. The survivors were left with a significantly higher standard of living, much like the English peasants after the Black Death. With the Peace of Westphalia in
I guess when the floor is so low.
1648, the 30 Years' War had finally ended. One of the most brutal and devastating conflicts that Europe had seen was over, and the civilians of the Holy Roman Empire could breathe a sigh of relief. We will continue talking.
Awesome. Thanks for the video. Yeah, it's extremely hard to watch sometimes, like because I try to put my feet in the shoes of individuals that were living throughout this time, and it's just you just can't. You just can't. It's like trying to not wake up from a nightmare. It's war is destructive. It's always going to be destructive. I mean, you have wars going on today in 2025. You can only learn from it. The shortcomings of famine and disease are always going to be there, especially when you have all these different peoples just colliding with each other. And then it doesn't help with what I said before with like the transformation of some of the formations, which allowed for more efficient usage of gunpowder, which meant more people would fall. Yeah, and like I said, what a ironic situation with this holy-esque war being such a destructive war. There's some context I probably missed. Leave me down there in the comments some context if you have any. Leave me some video suggestions if you have any. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.